The desert doesn't ask your name before it strips you bare. Isabella del Rio had learned this truth 3 months ago when she walked away from everything: her father's hacienda, her mother's tears, the wedding dress that hung like a ghost in her room. Now the New Mexico sun carved lines into her face that spoke of choices no 24-year-old should have to make. She had buried her name somewhere between the last mission bell and the first coyote howl, and what remained was just bone and breath and the terrible freedom of having nothing left to lose. The high desert stretched endlessly before her, beautiful and merciless, holding secrets in its red earth that only the exiled could read. Subscribe to discover how 2 lost souls find their way back to themselves in the most unlikely place. The mission ruins rose from the desert floor like broken teeth, their adobe walls crumbling under the weight of abandoned prayers. Isabella pressed her back against the cool stone, feeling the rough texture catch on her torn dress, once white cotton, now the color of dust and regret. 3 months of walking had worn her boots thin and her resolve thinner, but she had learned to find shelter in the bones of other people's faith. The wind moved through the empty doorways with a sound like sighing, and she closed her eyes, remembering when her name had weight, when Isabella del Rio meant something more than a ghost story whispered in her father's house. Her water was nearly gone, the leather pouch hanging light against her hip like a promise about to break. The desert had taught her to measure time not in hours, but in heartbeats, not in days, but in the slow burn of thirst that reminded her she was still alive. She had chosen this, chosen exile over the marriage bed, chosen hunger over the golden cage her father had built with such careful love. But choice, she had learned, was a luxury that the desert stripped away 1 grain of sand at a time, until all that remained was the simple mathematics of survival. The sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and copper that made her think of her mother's jewelry box, the one she would never open again. Isabella had left everything behind except the small silver cross that hung around her neck, a gift from her grandmother who had whispered stories of women who disappeared into the desert and became something else entirely. Now she understood those stories differently, felt their truth in the ache of her bones and the way the wind seemed to know her secrets. A sound made her freeze, not the familiar rustle of lizards or the distant cry of hawks, but something else. Footsteps, deliberate and careful, moving through the ruins with the confidence of someone who belonged to this broken place. Isabella's hand moved instinctively to the knife at her belt, the only protection she had learned to trust in a world that had taught her that safety was an illusion sold to women who stayed where they were told. The footsteps stopped just beyond the wall where she crouched, and she held her breath, feeling her heart hammer against her ribs like a caged bird. In the silence that followed, she could hear the desert holding its breath too, waiting to see what would emerge from this moment, predator or prey, salvation or destruction. The choice, she realized with bitter clarity, was no longer hers to make. When the shadow fell across the doorway, Isabella knew that her time of walking alone was over, though whether that meant death or something else entirely remained to be written in the sand and stone of this haunted place. The man who stepped into the ruins moved like water over stone, fluid, inevitable, and completely without sound until he chose to make it. Isabella saw him in pieces first, moccasined feet that knew every secret the earth kept, hands that hung loose and ready at his sides, and finally a face that belonged to the desert itself, carved by wind and sun into something both beautiful and dangerous. He was Navajo, she realized, though everything about him spoke of exile, of a man who had learned to carry his homeland in his bones because he could no longer carry it in his heart. His dark eyes found hers across the broken space, and Isabella felt something shift inside her chest. Not fear, though she should have been afraid, but recognition. Here was another soul who had chosen the wilderness over the cage, another heart that beat with the rhythm of the displaced. He didn't speak, didn't move closer, just stood in the doorway like a question the desert was asking her. His hair was long and black, caught back with a strip of leather, and his clothes spoke of a man who had learned to live between worlds, traditional buckskin mixed with the practical cotton of the frontier. "You're far from any road," he said finally, his voice carrying the careful cadence of someone who had learned English as a second language but spoke it with the precision of poetry. There was no threat in his words, but no comfort either, just the simple observation of a man who understood that the desert collected the lost and the broken like a museum of discarded dreams. Isabella straightened against the wall, feeling the silver cross press against her throat like a reminder of prayers she no longer knew how to say. "Roads are for people who know where they're going," she replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. 3 months of solitude had taught her that words were precious things, not to be wasted on pleasantries or lies. Something that might have been a smile touched the corners of his mouth, gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "And you don't know where you're going?" The question hung between them like smoke, carrying weight beyond its simple words. Isabella realized he wasn't asking about direction. He was asking about purpose, about the kind of knowing that came from the soul rather than the mind. "I know where I'm not going," she said, and felt the truth of it settle in her bones like an old ache. "That's enough for now." The admission surprised her with its honesty, but something about this stranger made lies feel impossible, as if the desert itself would reject any words that weren't carved from the bedrock of truth. He nodded once, a gesture that seemed to contain entire conversations, and Isabella understood that she was looking at a man who had made the same choice she had, to walk away from everything rather than become something he could not live with being. The mission ruins appeared at dawn, like broken teeth against the bleeding sky, adobe walls crumbling into the earth as if the very stones had grown weary of holding up a god who had long since turned his face away. Isabella felt her breath catch in her throat as they approached, the familiar scent of sage and decay mixing with something else, something that smelled like her childhood, like the incense that had burned in the chapel where she had once knelt and believed that obedience was the same thing as love. Nez walked beside her in silence, his eyes scanning the scattered remnants of what had once been someone's attempt to plant heaven in the desert, and she wondered if he could see the ghosts that seemed to move between the shadows, the spirits of women who had knelt here and prayed for deliverance that never came. The wind moved through the empty doorways like a sigh, carrying with it the whispered confessions of generations of girls who had been taught that their bodies belonged to everyone except themselves, and Isabella pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the wild beating of her heart against her ribs like a caged bird that had finally remembered it had wings. She had been here before, in dreams that felt more real than memory, standing in this exact spot where the altar had once been, watching her own reflection dissolve in the broken glass of stained windows that now lay scattered across the ground like fallen stars. Nez stopped walking and turned to face her, his dark eyes holding a question that he did not speak aloud, and Isabella realized that he was waiting for her to decide whether they would enter this place or walk around it, whether she was ready to face whatever waited for her in the shadows of her own past. The silence stretched between them like a bridge that she could either cross or burn, and she found herself thinking of all the times she had stood at the edge of something that terrified her, all the moments when she had chosen safety over truth, compliance over courage. But standing here now, with the desert wind lifting her hair and the sun painting the ruins gold, she felt something shift inside her chest, something that had been sleeping for so long she had forgotten it was there. She took a step forward, then another, her feet carrying her toward the broken doorway as if they remembered a path her mind had tried to forget, and she heard Nez fall into step behind her, his presence a steady warmth at her back. The threshold was nothing more than crumbling stone now, but as she crossed it, Isabella felt the weight of every prayer she had ever whispered in the darkness, every desperate plea for someone to see her as more than a vessel for someone else's dreams. Inside the ruins, the air was thick with the ghosts of incense and tears, and she could almost hear the echo of her own voice, young and trusting, promising to be good, to be quiet, to be whatever they needed her to be. The floor was littered with fragments of her former life, pieces of colored glass that had once told stories of saints and martyrs, chunks of plaster that had once held the painted faces of angels who had watched her kneel and confess sins she had not yet learned to commit. Isabella knelt among the debris and picked up a shard of blue glass, holding it up to the light streaming through the broken roof, and for a moment she could see through it to the girl she had been, small and frightened and so desperate to be loved that she had been willing to disappear entirely. Nez crouched beside her, his fingers brushing against a piece of carved wood that might have once been part of a pew or a confessional, and when he looked at her, she saw in his eyes the same recognition she felt in her own heart, the understanding that they were both standing in the ruins of who they had been told they should be. "I used to come here," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind that moved through the broken walls like the breath of sleeping ghosts. "When I was small, before I understood that prayers were just another way of asking permission to exist." He nodded, his fingers still tracing the grain of the weathered wood, and she realized that he understood what it meant to kneel in a place that had been built to make you smaller, to teach you that your own voice was less important than the silence that surrounded it. The sun moved across the sky above them, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across the ruins, and Isabella felt something loosening in her chest, some knot that had been tied so tightly for so long that she had forgotten it was there. When she finally stood, the blue glass still clutched in her palm, Isabella felt lighter somehow, as if she had left something heavy buried in the dust and debris of the ruined mission. Nez rose beside her, his movements fluid and careful, and she noticed the way he seemed to carry himself differently here, as if the sacred nature of the place, even in its destruction, demanded a certain reverence. They walked together through the remains of what had once been the nave, their footsteps echoing softly in the hollow space. And Isabella found herself thinking about all the women who had walked this same path, all the girls who had been brought here to learn that their bodies were temples that belonged to everyone except themselves. But there was something else here too, something that the builders of this place had not intended. A wildness that had crept in through the cracks, a desert spirit that had reclaimed the stones and made them part of something larger and more ancient than any human attempt to contain the divine. She could feel it in the way the wind moved through the space, carrying with it the scent of sage and cedar and something else that smelled like freedom, like the vast emptiness of the desert that stretched beyond the walls, and reminded her that there were places in the world where no one could tell her who she was supposed to be. Nez seemed to sense it too, the way his shoulders relaxed and his breathing deepened, as if he were drawing strength from the very air that moved between the broken stones. As they prepared to leave the ruins behind, Isabella turned back one last time to look at the place where she had once knelt and prayed for someone to save her, not understanding that salvation was something she would have to claim for herself. The afternoon light slanted through the broken roof, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits, and she felt a sudden surge of gratitude for the girl she had been, for the courage it had taken to keep breathing, even when breathing felt like an act of rebellion. Nez waited for her at the threshold, his silhouette framed against the endless blue of the desert sky, and she realized that he was not just waiting for her to catch up. He was waiting for her to choose, again and again, to keep walking toward whatever lay ahead. She took one last look at the blue glass in her palm, then let it fall to the ground where it caught the light and threw tiny rainbows across the dust, a small offering to the girl she had been and the woman she was becoming. When she finally walked through the broken doorway and back into the desert, Isabella felt the weight of the ruins lifting from her shoulders like a cloak she had been wearing for so long she had forgotten it was there. And for the first time in years, she felt ready to remember her own name. The Navajo Mesa rose from the desert floor like a sleeping giant, its red sandstone walls carved by wind and time into shapes that seemed to hold the memory of every prayer ever whispered in the shadow of its ancient presence. Isabella followed Nez up the narrow path that wound between the rocks, her breath coming short in the thin air, her legs burning with the effort of the climb. But something in the way he moved ahead of her, sure-footed and reverent, told her that this was not just a destination, but a pilgrimage. The higher they climbed, the more the world below seemed to fall away, until the desert stretched out beneath them like a vast ocean of gold and red, broken only by the distant mountains that rose like islands on the horizon. She could feel the weight of the place settling into her bones, a heaviness that was not burden but belonging, as if the mesa itself were welcoming her home to a place she had never been but had always known existed somewhere in the deepest chambers of her heart. Nez paused at a ledge carved into the rock face, his hand resting on the stone as if he were greeting an old friend, and when he turned to look at her, Isabella saw something in his eyes that she had not seen before, a softness that spoke of roots that ran deeper than exile, of connections that could not be severed by the judgment of others. The wind that moved across the mesa carried with it the scent of cedar and sage, but also something else, something that smelled like memory and belonging, and the kind of peace that could only be found in places where the earth itself remembered what it meant to be sacred. At the top of the mesa, the ruins of the village spread out before them like a map of lives once lived, stone foundations marking the places where families had gathered around fires, where children had played in the dust, where elders had told stories that connected the present to the past and the past to the eternal. Isabella walked among the remains with careful steps, sensing that she was moving through a place where the boundary between the living and the dead was thin as morning mist, where every stone held the echo of voices that had once filled this space with laughter and argument and the quiet murmur of daily life. Nez moved through the ruins with the familiarity of someone who had walked these paths before, his fingers trailing along walls that still stood, his eyes scanning the horizon as if he were looking for something that might still be there, waiting for him to return. She watched him pause at what might have once been the entrance to a dwelling, his head bowed as if he were listening to something she could not hear, and she realized that this was not just any village. This was his village, the place where he had learned to be who he was before the world had taught him that who he was not enough. The silence that surrounded them was not empty but full, pregnant with the weight of all the words that had been spoken here, all the dreams that had been dreamed, all the love that had been given and received in the shadow of these ancient walls. Isabella found herself drawn to a circular depression in the rock, worn smooth by countless feet, and as she stood at its edge, she could almost see the fires that had once burned here, could almost hear the voices that had risen in song and story and prayer. Nez appeared beside her, his presence as quiet and steady as the stone beneath their feet, and when he spoke, his voice was soft as wind through grass. "My grandmother used to say that the mesa remembers everything," he said, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon where the sun was beginning its slow descent toward the edge of the world. Every footstep, every tear, every moment of joy, it all becomes part of the stone, part of the story that the earth tells to those who know how to listen. Isabella felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition that went deeper than understanding, and she realized that she was standing in a place where memory was not just personal but collective, where the pain of one became the wisdom of many, where exile was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a different kind of belonging. She thought of her own grandmother, dead these 5 years, who had whispered to her in Spanish about the old ways, about the time before the missions and the marriages, and the endless litany of rules that had been designed to make women smaller than their own shadows. Here, on this mesa where the wind carried the voices of the ancestors, Isabella felt her grandmother's presence as clearly as if she were standing beside her, felt the weight of all the women who had come before her, who had faced their own moments of choosing between safety and truth. The sun continued its journey across the sky, painting the rocks in shades of gold and crimson, and Isabella found herself thinking about the nature of home, about the difference between the place where you are born and the place where you finally learn to breathe. Nez had settled himself on a flat stone, his legs crossed, his hands resting on his knees, and she could see in the set of his shoulders that he was not just resting but remembering, allowing the weight of this place to settle into him like water soaking into parched earth. She sat beside him, close enough to feel the warmth of his body, but far enough away to give him space for whatever ghosts he was entertaining. And together they watched the shadows lengthen across the ruins, watched the desert below them transform from gold to amber to deep, rich red. "I was born here," he said finally, his voice so quiet that she had to lean closer to hear him above the whisper of the wind. "In that house there, the one with the walls still standing. My mother labored for 2 days, and when I finally came, the medicine man said I was born with the spirit of the wanderer, that I would never be content to stay in one place for long." Isabella felt her heart clench at the sadness in his voice, at the way he spoke of his birth as if it were a prophecy of exile rather than a celebration of life. And she understood that he had been carrying the weight of that prediction for his entire life, had been trying to prove it wrong, even as he fulfilled it with every step that took him further from home. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Isabella felt something settling into place inside her. Some piece of herself that had been missing for so long she had forgotten it was gone. The mesa held them in its ancient embrace, and she could feel the presence of all the people who had ever stood in this place and looked up at these same stars, all the hearts that had broken and healed and broken again under this vast sky. Nez turned to look at her, and in the fading light his face was soft with something that might have been hope, might have been recognition, might have been the beginning of understanding that exile was not always punishment, but sometimes gift, sometimes the only way to find the person you were meant to be. "What was your name?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the wind that moved through the ruins like the breath of sleeping spirits. "Before you buried it, before you became the woman who walks alone, what did they call you when you were small and the world still felt like it might have room for who you really were?" Isabella felt tears gathering in her eyes, felt the weight of all the years she had spent trying to forget the girl she had been, and when she opened her mouth to answer, she found that her voice was steady, clear as the desert air that surrounded them. "Isabella," she whispered, and the name felt strange on her tongue, like a word in a language she had once known but had not spoken in years. And as it hung in the air between them, she felt something inside her chest unfurl like a flower that had been waiting for the right season to bloom. The fire crackled between them as the desert night settled around the mesa like a blanket woven from starlight and shadow. And Isabella watched the flames dance against the darkness, each flicker revealing and concealing the face of the man who sat across from her, this stranger who had somehow become the keeper of her buried name. Nez fed small pieces of dried wood to the fire with careful precision, his movements economical and sure, and she found herself thinking about the way he seemed to understand the language of necessary things, fire and water and shelter, and the delicate art of surviving in a world that had no use for people like them. The warmth reached across the space between them, touching her face and hands with gentle fingers, and for the first time in months, Isabella felt something that might have been safety, might have been the beginning of trust, might have been the recognition that she was no longer carrying the weight of her exile alone. The ruins around them seemed to lean in closer in the firelight, as if the ancient stones were eager to witness this moment, this tentative reaching towards something that neither of them had dared to name, but both of them could feel growing in the space between their carefully guarded hearts. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and watched the way the light played across Nez's features, revealing the scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a mark that spoke of violence survived, of pain that had been transformed into wisdom through the simple act of continuing to breathe. "Tell me about the scar," Isabella said, her voice soft as the whisper of wind through sage, and she saw something flicker in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition that she was asking him to trust her with the story of his wounding. Nez was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing patterns in the dust beside the fire, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of memory that had been carried alone for too long. "My father gave it to me," he said, the words falling into the silence like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that seemed to spread outward into the darkness. "The day I told him I would not marry the woman he had chosen, would not take my place in the line of men who had learned to swallow their own voices in order to keep the peace. He said I was choosing to be nothing, choosing to walk away from everything that mattered, and when I would not change my mind, he took his knife and marked me so that everyone would know what I had chosen." Isabella felt her breath catch in her throat, felt the familiar burn of tears behind her eyes, and she understood that they were both carrying the same wound, the same mark of refusal that had been carved into their flesh and their spirits by the people who were supposed to love them without condition. The fire popped and hissed, sending sparks spiraling up into the star-drunk sky, and she watched them rise and disappear, thinking about the way pain could be transformed into light if you were willing to let it burn. She reached up and touched her own throat, feeling the invisible scar that lived there, the mark left by all the words she had swallowed, all the screams she had bitten back, all the times she had chosen silence over the risk of being truly seen. "My father never used a knife," she said, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the flames, "but he marked me just the same. With his disappointment, with his shame, with the way he looked at me after I refused to marry the man he had chosen, like I had died, like I was already a ghost haunting the edges of his life." Nez looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw the reflection of her own pain, the recognition that they had both been wounded by love that came with conditions, by families that had taught them that belonging required the sacrifice of everything that made them who they were. The night air was cool against her skin, but the fire kept the worst of the cold at bay, and she found herself thinking about the way warmth could exist in the midst of darkness, the way two people could create light together even when the world around them seemed determined to snuff out every flame. She had spent so many nights alone, wrapped in her own arms, trying to convince herself that solitude was strength, that needing no one was the same thing as being free. But sitting here with Nez, sharing the stories of their scars, she began to understand that maybe freedom was not about being alone, but about choosing who you allowed to see you bleed. The fire burned lower as the night deepened, and Isabella found herself moving closer to its warmth, closer to the man who sat on the other side of the flames, like a guardian of secrets she was only beginning to learn how to tell. "What did they call you?" she asked, echoing his earlier question, and she saw him smile for the first time since she had known him, an expression that transformed his entire face, made him look younger, more vulnerable, more like the boy he must have been before the world had taught him that softness was a luxury he could not afford. "Nez," he said, and then, after a pause that seemed to contain entire conversations, "But my grandmother called me something else, something in the old language that meant the one who walks between worlds, the one who belongs everywhere and nowhere, who carries the medicine of the in-between places." Isabella felt something shift in her chest, some recognition that went deeper than words, and she realized that she was looking at someone who had been marked by the same gift that had marked her, the ability to see beyond the boundaries that others accepted without question, to understand that there were ways of being in the world that had nothing to do with the roles that had been assigned to them at birth. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and she felt connected to something larger than her own small story, something that included all the exiles and wanderers and refusers who had ever looked up at this same sky and wondered if there was a place in the world for people like them. As the fire burned down to glowing embers, Isabella felt the weight of the day settling into her bones, but it was a good weight. The weight of miles traveled and truths spoken, and the beginning of something that she did not yet have a name for, but could feel growing in the space between her heartbeats. Nez banked the coals with careful hands, ensuring that the fire would last through the night, and when he looked up at her, she saw in his eyes the same question that was forming in her own heart. What happened now? What came next? How did two people who had learned to walk alone begin to imagine walking together? "Isabella," he said, her name falling from his lips like a prayer, like a promise, like the first word of a story that was just beginning to be told, and she felt something inside her chest unfurl like wings that had been folded for so long she had forgotten they were there. The desert stretched out around them in all directions, vast and empty and full of possibility. And for the first time since she had walked away from everything she had ever known, Isabella felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The mesa held them in its ancient embrace, and the stars bore witness to the moment when two wounded people began to understand that their scars were not marks of shame, but maps that could lead them home to themselves, and to each other, and to the wild, untamed country of the heart that had been waiting for them all along.